Hey folks, this is Steve with Nonprofit Ally, and I have on the Skype line, it's actually video Skype line, I have Holly Rustic. She's actually in Guam right now, and she is the writer of Wish Granted, Tips, Tools, and Templates to Write a Winning Grant. It's actually, the book is pretty awesome because it comes with free templates and videos that come with it, and it's really awesome. And this is a topic that I'm really excited to talk about because, folks, I've been waiting for a grant writer to come on this podcast for a while. We've had one in the past, but I'm excited to have Holly with us now because she's an expert.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I'm so excited to be here today. Thank you for having me on your show.
Yeah, no worries. This is pretty cool. So I should also let the folks know that because this is a podcast, so people are listening to it, that at the same time that we're doing this podcast, we're also doing a Facebook Live on Holly's end. She's doing it with her listeners. So it's going to be kind of a cross-platform as well as a YouTube recording. So it'll be fun. This is going to be entertaining.
Yeah, it'll be a lot of fun.
The one thing I forgot to mention is Holly has a website. It's called grantwritingandfunding.com. Holly also has her own podcast. She has products on there, services. She also has workshops. So she's definitely the expert to be talking about at this moment. So Holly, usually I wait until the end of the podcast to talk about the person I'm interviewing's, what they're doing, how do they contact them. But I think you should pitch that now because I really want people to know all the things that you're offering before we start getting into all the nitty gritty. So give us kind of an overview of all these things that you're doing for the nonprofit world and grant writing.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So I have my own company, We Go Grants, We Go Consulting, and I do a lot of different work with nonprofits. My expertise is in grant writing, like you were saying before, and I've been a grant writer for more than 10 years, and I've been working for organizations internally and also as a consultant, and I also do federal grant reviews. So I've just seen every different side of the grant writing coin, so to speak. But I also, because grant writing isn't the be-all, end-all, and in order for grants to be successful, I also do governance and board training, organizational strategies, strategic planning, that sort of thing, and also diversification of funding. So it's not just about grants, but we also have to look at how to pull in volunteers, how to really embrace your stakeholders, and also what other kinds of funding there are out there. And like you do crowdfunding, that's important. So there's different diversification of funding, but grants are a great way to also, to focus on to get some funding, but it really shouldn't be the only thing. There's events if you do them strategically, once again, but it's really about how to manage your grants too, because even if you win a grant and you don't have a strong governance, you don't have a strong organization, then what? You might have to return monies potentially if you don't implement the grant properly, or you just won't really know how to manage it. It might not be a sustainable program after the grant has ended. So it's really important just to see the whole kind of coin. So what I offer are direct services for organizations, and I also have a book I've just published, like you said, my Wish Granted book, and I have some courses that I'll be launching soon. So yeah, so it really, to reach people on their learning level, and and I also, it's really exciting, I just recorded my book, so I'll have my first book on Audible, which will be really exciting. That's the Wish Granted book. Yeah. So that was a lot of work.
Did you narrate it?
I did.
Oh,
yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I narrated it. So that was a lot of hours.
All right. Well, cool. You mentioned something in there right away, and so you mentioned seeing the whole coin, and how. So I'm a nonprofit. I'm looking at all these different grants, and you talked about the prep and the writing, and you got to realize all the follow-up work and all the things they're going to be due. How do you take all that in before knowing the grant you're going to apply for? So how do you see that whole coin?
I think it's actually to do it backwards. Now a lot of people approach me just to do the grants, right? So they want to do this grant. So then I kind of have to go backwards and figure out, well, what's your organization? How is it built? How is it formed? Because you have to include a lot of that information in grant writing anyway. So it's kind of like you go backwards. But if you go forwards, it's a little bit easier to start from the get-go if I'm working with nonprofits, because I work with startup nonprofits too. And that's a lot easier because it's before kind of bad habits, quote unquote, have been learned or whatever. You can kind of just prevent and mitigate a lot of things that might not work, and spent money that shouldn't have been spent in certain areas, and just the whole people quitting, and there's a high turnover rate at nonprofits. So it's about how to, once again, go back to the board and go back to the organization strategic plans and really figure out what works well and how to kind of have a kickoff launch, and I do a lot of retreats and strategic planning in that way. So it's even if your organization has been around for a while, does everybody know the vision? Does everybody know the mission? So it's not just about chasing money. It's really about going back and saying, who are we serving? What do we do? Does everyone that work here embrace that vision? And do they even know it, or do they have to Google it? So it's really about that.
Yeah, I guess from what the grants that I've written, they always ask that kind of information. So knowing, figuring out your vision, your mission, and all that ahead of time, or writing that into the grant, because you always have to write that into the grant. It could be a good exercise for the whole board if they're not up to speed on that.
Absolutely. And just knowing their roles too, because some boards, it might be a thing of where each is wanting to bring in money, right? So they commit to, I'm going to bring in $5,000 for this organization, or, what their responsibilities, what their roles are. And it's not just, oh, I'm on a board, so it's kind of a distinguished thing, but it's like, no, you're here to be action oriented and to make sure everyone has a good matrix of skills. So you have different people with different skills that represent your population as well that you're serving. So you can really be strategic in once you do, talk about grants and writing and grants and getting grants, it makes sense. It's not a stretch for anybody.
Right. It's kind of like creating the pieces to your puzzle ahead of time and making sure they're really well filled out and thorough and researched ahead of time.
Absolutely.
The question that I get a lot, and actually even for myself and my nonprofit, is trying to find who to apply to. Like, how do you go about doing that? Because a lot of them are pay services, and a lot of nonprofits don't have the money to join. I can't think of any off my head. You probably know the ones there's organizations you can sign up for, and they tell you where all the grants are.
Right. A lot of foundation directories. They have the foundation directory online, foundation search. Grants.gov is the government, federal grants. So
Grant Station, is that what it is? I'm thinking of a couple of them, but they're paid services. So how does a nonprofit go about even finding available grants for their organizations?
Yeah, it's difficult, and sometimes it can be, you have to invest. Sometimes you might want to do that. Grants.gov is free, so that's good. That's where the federal grants are. But also another platform that's, I think, very underused is called GuideStar. And GuideStar is where you can go. It's they have different levels that you can join and pay, but you don't have to use the service. And that's a great place to find if you already kind of articulate some foundations and you want to look. And you can check through their 990s, which is fantastic, because you can see exactly who they've actually given to and for how much and for what. Right. So that is, like, for me, I've done a lot of research through that platform for free. Of course, it's time consuming, but it's worth it. It's less time consuming than sending the same application to 100 different foundations and not being articulate. You know what I mean? So, and getting it rejected. So, but you can, foundation directory, there's different things, and they do cost money. But, it just depends on what you're really looking for. I tell a lot of nonprofits too, find out what other similar organizations are to yours. Google them up, look on their websites, and see who they're getting funding from, because a lot of times they will publish, we received this grant or whatever on their social media. And you can really link up and say, okay, that's the same kind of thing that matches ours, and then do your research on the foundation. There's definitely different, it depends if you're going after foundation grants, if you're going after federal grants, or if you're going after like state contracts. Right. So there's different ways to do it. And a lot of times that's going on their websites to see what's available, what the RFPs are, the requests for proposals and that sort of thing, to find out what's actually available. But it really comes back to making relationships with those funding sources so you can be alerted when those things come out.
Right. Yeah, actually, that's true. There's times they'll let me know, like if I've applied for a grant, like through the Rasmussen Foundation, which is here in Alaska, they'll send me out an email like we're open now to receive tier 1, tier 2 grants. So just let us know about that. I like your idea about going to other organizations, other organizations. GuideStar too. Yeah, I wrote GuideStar down too. So GuideStar.com, right? Or is it .org?
I think it's .org. Yeah.
Okay, it might be.
I think so.
They're really
One
cool.
Or the other.
We could do a whole episode on GuideStar because they offer a lot of advantage. But what I wanted to follow up on was the idea that I wanted to point out that I really liked was the idea of going to other nonprofits similar to yours and trying to figure out who they got their grants from, because you're right. They usually will post it on their Facebook or their website, hey, we got this grant. Or better yet, I think we're nonprofits, so we're not super competitive. And so we're not looking for, we're not holding our information like a for-profit would be like, I'm not telling you where I got my money. If I called a director of a nonprofit that did something similar to mine and I asked them, hey, where would you suggest getting grants for products or for a new a new piece of equipment or whatever? Hey, are you still there? You just kind of froze. Are you there? Oh, and I got you in 3 windows here. So, folks, we got cut off there, and we have resumed recording through Holly's phone. So apparently Guam internet service is actually worse than Alaska. So there you go. Now we know. Good to have you back.
About that. Yeah, we're kind of far away. It's good to be back.
Yeah. You know what? These phones are amazing, though. The video isn't that worse than what we had through your computer, and the sound is nearly equally as well.
Awesome. Okay, perfect.
So let's see if I can get my thought back. I was talking about your idea of contacting other organizations and seeing who they applied through, because the point was that nonprofits would most likely share this information, where a for-profit might be like, nope, that's proprietary. I'm not sharing with you how I did that. Right. Can you, I guess, is that a pretty common way to do it? It's one that I never even thought about.
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely contact them. I think certain people are willing to share more over than not, although you will have people that don't want to compete. But usually if it's not in your region, it's okay. It's not in direct competition in your kind of in your city or whatnot. So, but even then, if you're in a big enough city, people are willing to collaborate, I believe. And I've seen that happen. I've seen it, and it's fine if people will say, oh, where are you getting your funding? Is that a good source? And they kind of want to powwow and share those ideas. And I think that's really good. And it's relevant, to, because then you can share too, well, we got these sources from here. And that's the thing, grant writing is competitive, obviously. And, so a lot of people, sometimes they don't want to collaborate because they feel like, well, we're competing. But my thing is always, even in the same region or area, like on Guam, right? We're one island, we're a small island. And there's quite a few sources that are organizations that might go after the same funding source. And sometimes they don't want to share information. But what I try to encourage is say, if you're doing the same kind of thing and you want to integrate or be partners, that's good. Like that'll help benefit and help your scoring on applications. And the other thing is, if you want to write the other organization in, for a little bit of money or to do an activity under your project, that's even better. And they can do the same for you. So if one organization, only one organization is going to get this grant, then, you have a higher chance of getting something out of it.
Right.
So that's a great way to collaborate.
Yeah, and it's good also, I think, just to develop that relationship with other nonprofits, because you may learn something about them. They may feel free to share tips, or you may end up being like, oh, I didn't know you were doing that program. Maybe we should talk further. Like other things come out of that. So
yeah, and sometimes you might even realize, hey, you know what? We actually don't need a grant because we can do this thing together. We have shared resources now, and that's more sustainable. So that's really a great way to look at it, to say, okay, let's share resources. Maybe we'll do a fundraiser together so we can tap into each other's contacts, and we're not chasing the same sponsors, right? In one area, a lot of times the sponsors get tapped out because everyone's tapping into them. But instead of doing it separately, let's do it together, because then we can really aggressively do that instead of trying to compete against each other with the same sponsors and corporations and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's good. So I'm gonna I have 2 different questions, and I'm gonna try to I'm gonna ask. Let's see here. So in the past nonprofit that I used to work at, the idea of getting grants was always very important for them. I always wanted to get grants, and I just remember a board member saying to me, I was the ED at the time, this was for a animal shelter, and they had said, we need more grants. And I was like, okay, what for? And she's like, I don't care what for, we just need more money. So can you, I didn't have the words, I was a little bit stunned. I was like, what am I supposed to do with that? Maybe you can walk us through what the issues are with that, and maybe how to, because yeah, of course you need more grants. that's the first thing, but that's not. What else do you need besides that to actually go and get that grant?
Right. I call that chasing the money.
Right. Yeah,
They
there you
don't
go.
do that. Yeah. So I see that a lot as well. I do. We just need funding. We just need money. What's out there? We'll make it happen. And it's like, well, the problem, I mean, there's a lot of problems with that, but one of the problems and challenges is that all of a sudden you're not developing projects. You're just developing reactionary projects that might not fit in with your mission and your vision. So the idea of them being sustainable or not taxing or burning out your workforce, because that's huge. So, and the other thing is a lot of those organizations, and the reason they're doing that, the reason they want money and they don't care where it's coming from and they're not thinking about projects, is because that's usually a reflection that their organizational costs aren't being funded. And they're trying to fund their organizational administrative costs, right, through those grants.
And you can't.
And
do
grants
that.
are not meant to do that. Yeah, you can get a little bit if you have an indirect cost rate and that sort of thing. But some grants do allow for that. But most grants, capacity building and that sort of thing, but most grants are for projects. And that would be oh my gosh, this one grant trainer that I always go to his trainings, he's from Hawaii, Keone, and he comes out here to do trainings, and he explains it like an octopus. So if you look at the head of the octopus, that's the head of the organization. And then all of the tentacles, that come out the legs, those are projects. And what happens is if you're trying to feed the head with the projects, the octopus starts to eat its arms. And all of a sudden, that's not good. It dies. So that's what happens to organizations. And that always sticks with me, that image, because it's like, wow, that's so accurate. In a lot of organizations, they try to fund their overhead organizational costs with these grants, and it just doesn't work. So that's one of the outcomes I see of just get grants anywhere, because their organizational overhead costs are not being met, and that's why they're panicking.
Right.
And there's, sorry, go ahead.
That's the term chasing the money. Now makes so much more sense to me, and what that means. I've always said, chasing the money, you're just trying to go where the money goes, but really you're just trying to, that grant looks good. There's a lot of money there, so we'll develop a program around that grant. Right. Then you're feeding the head and not the programs.
Yeah. And what you need to do is, before you're even looking at grants, is to start developing projects. And then you start doing the research for grants to see which ones would support those projects. And if you do it that way, then the projects you develop are really ones that serve the need in the community, right? Because you're going to be developing, you're not thinking about money at that point in time. You're just thinking about what are the needs in our community? How can we serve them? How does that fit with our mission and vision? And once you develop projects, then you say, okay, now let's go look for funding. Now let's see what's available. Let's see what our partners are doing, how we can partner, how we can get more resources. So that's really the way it should be, instead of just like go out there and find anything. Of course, some things might come up when you're doing research and say, hey, this looks really cool. This would be something that would serve our community. And that's absolutely fine. Right. But you still have to make sure you have the funding to do it. It's just not another thing that same program manager, all of a sudden you're going to throw another entire project on his or her lap without giving them funding, right? So all of a sudden they're like, okay, now I have to run another project, but I'm not actually, just maybe some of my salary is being funded under this, but now I have like 10 projects I'm running, and they get burned out, and that's where you see the high turnover rate, like I was originally talking about. Right.
And those projects end up fizzling out. They don't get supported. They're just kind of they're there for a year or two. Right.
Yeah.
So
and that's
project
what grants
first.
Are. They're just like startup money. Yeah, they're just like startup money. It's kind of like getting your startup kind of capital going for something, and that's all they're really meant to be. And then you sustain it afterwards. But a lot of people think the grant is going to be the funding source forever for this project, or once it's over, then that's fine. And it's that's not really the idea of grants.
Right. So there's something beyond the grant.
Yeah.
So after
absolutely.
you get that grant, then that you've established that program, and then you sustain it in other ways. And it could be through grants, but there's other things going on at that point.
Yep. So absolutely.
So that brings me to another question then. So when it comes to chasing money, right? Like this, we just need more money. Is there it's not status quo. What's the word I'm looking for? Is there a norm for the percent of your revenue, the percent of your budget that you should expect to come from grants? That would be a good way of putting it. I've never really kind of put it in that context before.
because it really depends on the organization and their history and how many grants they've gotten to really how competitive they're going to be with grants in some ways. But I would say you want to, like I was talking about before, diversification is key. If you're doing 100% on grants, which some organizations do, I mean, that's all well and good, but it's not, it's always a panic situation in a way. There's that underlying kind of when the grant runs out, am I going to have a job? Or I think you still need to come up with other sources, definitely. So I wouldn't say that there's a certain percentage, but you should, I mean, yeah, definitely going after grants is a great thing to do. But other funding sources could be a lot easier and long-term. So that's what you have your stakeholders, your resources, really your volunteer base and tapping into other things.
Right, which is another reason to keep really good stats about all that you're doing, because as you develop this program and you realize, well, this grant was to help us start, we need to move on. Now we got to go pitch it to a sponsor or a funder or a foundation or somewhere else, right, to kind of sustain that money. Now you have like the proof is in the pudding type stuff. So part of getting a grant is you'd mentioned that you want to have a good score, a good on that. Now, is our grant scored basically the same? Explain the scoring process.
Yeah. Okay. The scoring process. Right. So basically, in every grant you have, if that's a foundation request for proposal, excuse me, or if it's even a funding opportunity announcement on grants.gov. So you have an application that you have to look at to apply for a grant. And within that, they'll tell you exactly what they want to see. And they will put on there how many points. I mean, a majority of times they'll have on there or like what kind of points for each section. And those sections are usually about the same kind of things about your organization, of course, your budget, your project approach, the needs and your target demographic, and then your objectives and your outcomes. So they kind of want to see those things. Basically, all grants kind of cover those things. Some have logic models or they have more details or evaluations, but that's kind of a general approach, whether that be a 2-page foundation application or a 50-page federal grant. That's kind of but they'll have different scoring for those different sections. And even sometimes they'll have another section where it's just for scoring. They'll say, this is what the scoring panel is going to be looking at. And that might be a little bit different than what the original application says. So you really want to go to the scoring criteria, that part in the application, and look at that and really base your proposal off of that. And once you submit it, then it goes, generally, this is what would happen. I mean, on a foundation, it might go to a board, usually goes to their board that would review it. Federal grants, it'll go to the source, which have external evaluators. So I'm a peer reviewer. So they have people in the community that work with similar programs, usually for those grants. Or if it's like NOAA, right? NOAA does a lot of grants, and they have scientific, marine biologists and stuff like that for their panels. So you kind of have to be a part of a panel, which I totally, if you're out there in an organization, apply to be a federal reviewer, because you will learn so much about grants through that process. And you also get paid a little bit, which is nice, but because it's a very intense period. But basically what you'll do is you'll be on a panel with 3 or 4 other people, and you all have to score the grant according to that criteria, which is why I say write the grant to the criteria. Use that as your template. Those are your headers. Follow that. Don't look at anything else, because that's what the people who are scoring are going to be, grading you on or scoring you on. And then they'll come to a consensus. They have a chair. So some people might say, oh, that's really low. Other people will say, that's really high score. And you kind of have to battle it out, right? Come to like a medium ground. And then your chair will submit these scores, your facilitator will, and then that'll go to their kind of hub or their main reviewers on that federal agency. And then that will go through a computerized weighting system. So it is a very, very rigorous process. And that's why it takes so long. So people say, well, that's going to take another year before, if I write it now, I might not even get the award until 6 to 9 months from now. And that's why they really want to make sure it goes through the most non-biased process to have a rigorous review on that.
Very thorough evaluation.
Very thorough.
Yeah.
And I mean, foundation, like I said, it might just go through the board. That's a little bit easier. But on foundation grants, I will say, don't be discouraged if you get rejected your first or second time you submit to a foundation. A lot of foundations won't even really seriously consider your application until they see it 3 years in a row, because they're so used to getting these startup nonprofits that just fizzle out. So don't be discouraged. You just have to kind of go through, I'm going to resubmit so many years until I can really be even seriously considered. But don't just submit. Send them your brochures throughout the year. Invite them to events that you have going on without asking them for money.
Yep.
Like develop those relationships. It's all about developing a relationship.
Yeah. It's a good point because and I always say, don't be afraid to call them. Like if you're going to apply to them, there's someone there, give them a call, say, hey, we're going to apply. Would we even qualify? And you have any tips, and they've always been really friendly. We, my nonprofit's relatively new, and we went through a pretty rigorous process. And the person that was doing the review kept calling me back and saying, you're still new. Can we take this down a little bit? You're asking for this much. They usually don't find.
Oh, that's great.
Ones. Yeah.
I mean, not that they ask you for less, but I mean that they're communicating that.
No, it was super. They called me back at least 2 times. Because we were going for $20,000 of equipment, and we ended up getting $6,000 of equipment. But we got it, and it was through working with them, and we built a relationship, and we're on a first name basis with the evaluator there, and so next grant we write. They know that we're easy to work with and we're flexible. So
and that's the thing, and you'll probably be a continuing source, through that foundation, right? So it was through a foundation. So so there you'll probably be one of the. And once they close off and say we're not accepting solicitations anymore, you'll be in the pool. So I mean that's more than 20,000 you'll probably end up getting through them.
Yeah, well, we'll be back to them for sure. So
that's great. That's good.
So you mentioned a couple things here, sticking to the criteria that they're asking for, like when you're going through the scoring thing, sticking to that. And I think that's really important. I think sometimes people are like, well, no, they should know about this, and they should know that. Some famous person came to our event, or they make sure we throw
fluffy
that in there.
Butterfly stuff.
Yeah. So, any tips on keeping really honed in on that, like not to get the fluffy stuff in there?
Yeah. You just have to stick to the criteria, use their wording, so use their verbiage that they're using, and also stick to their page limitations. Make sure you're using that, 12-inch font times New Roman, 1-inch margins, whatever because they'll specify what they want. And if they don't, just stick to the safe side and use that. You want it to be clear. A lot of times there are page limitations too, so you have to stick to that, and you can communicate your language and your style, but you want it to be reflected in what they're asking for. So if you think it's so imperative that so-and-so came to visit or whatever, you can just put one sentence and that's it. You know what I mean? Or maybe you can have an attachment. You can see there's attachments and include a media attachment of that, and don't even mention it in your grant if you don't have room for it. And that's fine too. That'll show, because you want to leverage things, but at the same time, you don't want to be whining. You don't want to, I've seen some of that too. Oh, woe is me. Oh, woe is us. You want to have a plan, and you want to be able to stick to what they're asking for, and, and just be very, very clear, use very clear language. I mean, if you have an editor, have an editor go through that and just make sure it's very clear and succinct, and that's what they want to see. They don't want these long run-on sentences and these whole things. If you can bullet point even, make it easy to read, make it easy. Because a lot of times as reviewers, they're exhausted and they're like, if I can't find the information, I'm not going to give you a score on this. And they're tired. This is an intense period of time for reviewers. So you want to make it as clear and as precise as possible.
So I've heard in the past, storytelling is really big in the nonprofit world, and people are starting to throw storytelling into their grant writing. So this is an example of how we serve someone, or this is an example of how we're going to use this equipment, right? But I can also see that becoming very wordy, and then all of a sudden you've gone away from the criteria. Does storytelling have a place in grant writing?
It does. I think it does. And if you're just clear with it, because it tells you, and I say that's qualitative. So if you're going to put some research in there and your needs, right, because you're going to have to put some stats in there at some point. And if you throw in a story, that's a way of throwing a qualitative stat really into it. So if this is how we serve, this is a quick example. Don't go into the whole backstory, but just, you might want to show something. I've also called them case studies. So I've thrown in case studies, and that's a good way of saying I'm sharing a story. It's just a different way of saying it, different semantics really. And they do want to see stats. They do want to see how you served. You can pull the heartstrings just a little bit, definitely do that, but you don't go on and on or away from the criteria. If it fits within the criteria, and I would say it would most best fit into the needs section where you're also putting down some stats, you're just really giving some language to statistics in a different way. Right, so I would say that's a qualitative way of showing that.
Okay. Yeah, it just reminds me of a grant that we were writing, and we were doing it in a kind of a team effort. And this is something I want to talk to you about, like how to do a team approach to grant writing.
Right.
But I remember the draft, and it was like, holy cow, is this long story that someone wrote, and we kind of had to re-edit it, and it wasn't relative. I was like, but it was probably a really good story for the fundraiser, because it was a heartstring, right? It was a beautiful story about a woman with a disability that met a dog, and it was great. But it wasn't grant worthy.
Well, where else you could put that? This would be a great place to put that, and this is where I've seen it too, is through a letter of testimony that you attach. So if you can have attachments, then include that letter of testimony and have it from her even, or from that individual where she would sign her name. And that would be very powerful, but it wouldn't be take away from the concept of the grant. You know what I mean? Like the direction, but it would just be like, this is why this program has really helped me. Right. And they do like to see those kind of things, funding sources do.
Yeah. I remember the criteria for one of the grants, they actually had a word count. It was like, you have 300 words. And so it's not a good time to use fluff in there. So you got to make sure you really condense that in and be really specific.
Yes.
So that team. Let's talk about that, because I think that's in your book. I think you talk about kind of a team approach. That grant funding team, is that just? Because I always picture a grant writer on their own in some corner, quietly, right next to the bookkeeper, doing their thing. So, what's that grant writing team about?
All right, so it's important. I have been that grant writer by myself in the corner quite a bit, and this is why I say that it's such a better approach when I have a team to work with. And basically your team, this is ideal, all right? This is the ideal team, and everyone's going to adjust it according to their organization. But if you can do this, pull this together, it's great. So you want to have your ED, your executive director, right? So you want to have your grant writer lead. You actually want to have a lead. You want to have a grant writer coordinator, and you want to have your accountant or your bookkeeper. So you need that budget person in there as well. And then any specialists that you might have. So if you are writing, a certain like scientific grant or certain grant for SAMHSA that you need certain, a person, a counselor or something, and their input. But you do want the grant writer lead to actually write the grant. Now, you want to have a kickoff meeting. You want to have those people involved. And even through my website, you can get a free downloadable that has list of questions that you can ask at this. So that's a great. But what you want to have is everybody kind of come on board and say, okay, what are we going to do? Here's the grant. Let's read the grant. Let's go through. Are we eligible? Do we have our SAM number in place? And that's a number that you need to submit for federal grants. Do we have our 501c3 all taken care of? Is everything on board? Just are we eligible? Make sure you check that off first. When's the deadline? Okay, everyone's on board. This is the deadline. Let's work backwards now. And then you want to go into, before you write the whole approach and the whole flowery thing, right? Getting all that out there, like this is what we want to do. Before you even do that, you want to break down your objectives. What is the objective? Or you might have up to 3 objectives, right? Mm-hmm. What are we actually going to accomplish? And you have to make it SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. Like you really want to make sure it can be 1 or 2 sentences. That's it. And then you want to say, hey, bookkeeper, what do we need for money? Okay, so this is the amount that we can ask for. Now you can start breaking down based on your objective. You can look at what activities do we need to accomplish to make that objective happen. And then you have your budget person say, well, this is how much money you need. And then you have and this could be like maybe a 2-hour meeting that you could really break all this down. It doesn't have to be super long, but you want all these people in place. And the reason I say the executive director, even if he or she then says, okay, guys, that's good. I'm signing off for this. That sounds great. Let me just review the grant after it's written. And they walk out. That's all you really need them for. Really, unless the executive director's off. So the grant writer, which in a lot of cases for smaller nonprofits, that is.
Yes.
But you do want that endorsement. You definitely want the endorsement, because otherwise they come back. If you write the grant and then you submit it to the executive director, who might have all those numbers to submit through grants.gov or whatever, then they say, oh, this isn't exactly what I need. And then you have to rewrite the whole thing. So that's the reason I say you really need the involvement. But you want the grant lead, of course, will be overseeing and writing the whole thing so it has the same style. But they also need to ensure everything from the budget is in the grant. And everything from the grant is in the budget. I've seen that separated where people are like, oh, we're asking for this equipment, say a trailer to haul something or another, or whatever, trees or something, right? And then you're doing gardening or a big thing, something. And then in the grant, it's not in there. So, you know, all of a sudden I know right away they had two different people working on this and they didn't come together. And this grant, it's not cohesive. They're not going to get good scoring
Right.
on those sections because of that. So you definitely want someone to be the one who writes everything and make sure that accountant or bookkeeper, like I said, is involved. And plus the writer themselves might need to know, well, how much do people in this position get paid? Like if you have standard rates, right? We need to know that so we can incorporate it into the grant and that sort of thing. Now, your grant coordinator, why it's important to have a grant coordinator, and once again, this is ideal, they're the person who's going to run around and get your letters of support. If it's a matching grant, they're going to get those letters of matching, non-federal matching share. They're going to go ahead and they're going to contact the people that need to be contacted, you know, for any other information and resources. So that is a great person to have if you're able to have that person. And then, of course, your expert, they would be writing anything that needs to be, you know, very evidence-based practices that you use that maybe the grant writer doesn't know all that information. They can get those kind of, you know, information to them as well. And your ED, the other thing that's good about your ED is you want them to endorse the whole project, the grant writing project, right? Before it even starts, because if as a grant writer, this has been my issue a lot of times, and it's difficult, is I say, hey, so-and-so, I need this information. Hey, human resources, I need all the information on resumes. I need the updated resumes for this grant. And they won't respond to me for 2 weeks. Grants due soon because they're busy, and I totally get that. But there's no pressure or task from me as a grant writer, but the ED kind of comes in and says, hey, everyone, you know, you need to respond to the grant coordinator or the grant lead very timely. It just makes sure that everyone knows it's a priority and that they'll do it because grants are timely. So that would be your perfect team.
Yeah, that's a great breakdown too, because then that team, if you do that, it's not a big, it's still a big job, but it's not a big job that one person is trying to do all of this because, and you're halfway through this and 3/4 through that and you're still waiting for this. And there's where that coordinator comes in and helps out. I like that. Yes.
And they can get those like resumes and bios from the board and all that other stuff while you're just focusing on, I need to write this grant, you know, so, and I need to make sure it's all everything together, but I need this other resources. So, that's, and it is good. And for those organizations that are listening that might not have written a grant before, even if they feel like it's overwhelming and everything, it's worth the whole process, even if you don't get awarded, because you will have this information all of a sudden for subsequent grants. So all of a sudden you have those resumes, you have, you know, the bios from the board, you have about the organization, and you have some of the needs, statistics and research already done. So it makes future grant writing a lot easier.
Now, so let's go back to this meeting because I like this idea, and you mentioned a download. So let's make sure I get that link because we'll make sure we put it in the show notes so people can get that information. Going into this meeting, I have a team of, I have my bookkeeper with me, I have my ED, or maybe you are the ED, and you have someone who's going to help coordinate it. You have a team together. Are you going in with specifically, hey, this is the grant we're going for? Or are you going with several different grants? You're going to try to figure out which one you're going to go for? And what else do you need in that meeting to make it productive? Do you need what type of software? What do you need on hand to make this meeting work?
Those would be specifically if you already had a grant identified, but you could, if you're looking at a couple of different grants, do it at the same time. That's absolutely fine. But it is already, that's more of a meeting where you already have, like I said, you've already read the request for proposal or the funding opportunity announcement. You're going over the eligibility. You're just going over a check mark. So what I've developed is a check mark. So you make sure that you get everything done. But I've also developed, so you have objectives where your activities are, who the person lead is, so the lead responsible on for each item, and the deadline. So you can write all of those things down in this meeting. You can already get that already arranged. Like you said, what that does is it takes away the overwhelming, oh my gosh, this is so much I need to do, and it breaks it down and it gives you guys like, okay, let's meet, next week, and then we can reflect on, have like a little report of status. And it doesn't make it like, when am I going to do this? I'm pulling my hair out. But it organizes it so everyone's on task, and it can really be a very high quality grant application.
Right. So when you go into this grant, you go through this meeting, you have everyone's kind of got their assignments, right? And so it's been productive. Yeah. You guys feel everyone's kind of on the same page. Is there something that's more important than the other? Is there a more important element in grant writing than other things that are, there's a lot of balls in the air, right? So is there a more important element?
Well, Sometimes, I mean, you could argue that the highest scoring section would be most important, right? So if you're looking at it as a completely like, okay, this is portion, our project approach is 35 points, our need section is 15, our budget's 10. But honestly, all of those points count. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. And that's why you really want the team, because each person is kind of their expert in that field, if you will, like your budget, person is going to be getting the budget well done. So, and every point really does count. But what's the most important is really having your objectives clear and your needs statement. You want to develop a needs statement, your objective. And then once you have those two things, honestly, everything else just flows. You know your budget, you have your objective and your needs statement. So I guess those are three things. But everything else from that, then your project approach just flows, because it's easier to get points that way. You understand what you're doing. If you write it the other way, if you write your project approach first and then you try to figure those other things out, I guarantee you that you're going to be revising your grant probably 2 or 3 times, because you're like, oh, wait, that doesn't really make sense. We have to redo this. So you really want to do it the other way. And so I wouldn't say it's a more important section, but it kind of is, because if those are clear, everything else flows.
So start with needs and objectives.
Yeah, and your budget. You got to, if you look at the triad together, then you're like, okay, I understand what I need to do. The rest is details, really.
Right. And this is going to be probably not as obvious a question or obvious answer as some may think. The difference between needs and objectives?
Yeah, your needs are really what's needed in the community. So, and you don't want to sit there. Here's one tip is if you use the words, don't say, there is a need for, I use this kind of example a lot. Say if we have a community where you're having soccer, you're serving kids, underserved youth with soccer games or, soccer program. And you say there is a need for soccer in our community or healthy activities. You're actually telling me the solution. See what I mean? You're not telling me the need. You're telling me the solution. But if you say 20 or 75% of kids ages 14 to 23, I guess, or 15 to whatever, 18 in our community have diabetes or something like that. I'm just throwing out numbers, but you can't do that. You want to be able to reference it here in this interview. But say, if they have diabetes or they're at risk of health issues, compared to the national average, say, of 12%, then you're telling me a need. Then you're telling me that's clear. And your solution is the soccer games. That's your objective. We're going to have, 5 soccer games over the course of a year that will serve kids those ages who are at risk in our community. Then all of a sudden you're saying the need and you're showing me the objective and the solution.
Right. So that's a good example. I like that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. And if you use the word even in your needs section, there's a lack of free soccer camps for at-risk youth. That's too abstract, and I don't really understand what that means. Does that mean there's 3 other ones? Does that mean there's none? If there's none, just come out and say it. There are no, and that shows, soccer camps for at-risk youth, and that shows me a very clear need.
Right. And in that needs, is that when you're also kind of stating the importance of it? Because if there's a lack of something, well, maybe there's a lack of it because it's not that important.
Right. Well, exactly. Yeah, that's a good thing to point out. So yeah, is that even important then? Right. Because some of these grants, they're passionate and, it's passionate to you and it's important to you. But when people are reviewing it, they're like, I don't really understand why that's a problem if they don't have that, or, if there's a lack of it. So you really have to point out how it's a need and relate it to a broader community concept or goal. So if you have a strategic plan for your community and say that one of the issues in there or one of the goals in there is to improve health for all, you could relate it to that community goal, right? So all of a sudden you're kind of you're showing the need that's in conflict with the goal. So you're saying this is how it's going to link together. And that way people say, okay, I get that, why that's a problem.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's important to explain that when you're writing that, because sometimes people think that need is so self-evident. Well, duh, it seems self-evident. Well, you still have to put it in writing somehow and make sure that it's expressed as a need.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
let's do a little more on objective too, because connecting these two I think is important. So that need
Very
is you identify that. Now the objective, you said it's kind of the solution. It's the end results. It's what you're going to do.
Yeah, I mean, you have goals. So you have your goal, you have your objective, and your outcomes. And your objective, I love objectives because they're just so clear. And what you can do is you can, like I said before, break it down into a SMART objective. So is it specific enough? Is it measurable? Is it achievable? Is it relevant? And is it time bound? And what I always say, just as a tip, is always start out with the time bound. You can say, and you look at what is this funding cycle for? So maybe it's a federal grant that's funding a year-long program and it's going to end September 30, right before the end of before the new fiscal year, right? So, or it could be a foundation grant that's maybe just a few months long. So you really have to look at what their criteria for the funding is when it needs to be, totally expended, and then relate that project to that. Otherwise, if you have it that surpasses the funding period, it doesn't make sense. So, and in light of this example, you might say, okay, by the end of 12 months, this is your objective. So I always say to start with the end, with the time bound, by the end of this period of time, and then you say exactly, then you get into your specific, what are you going to achieve? We'll say 100 at-risk youth will receive or will have sponsorships. Yeah, we'll receive sponsorships for summer camps or soccer camps, right? So you're being very, very specific. Is that measurable? Sure. How many kids signed up? Yeah. You know what I mean? And then you go into your activities and you can evaluate all of those activities. You can do your recruitment, selection, all of that kind of thing. You can really break it down. But if it's specific enough, then I know, okay, you know what? 100 kids who are at risk are going to receive scholarships to attend soccer camp by the end of 12 months. Like that's just so clear. Right. So you really want to use that kind of format on your objective to make sure that the funding source knows, okay, I can measure this. It's tangible. Yeah. And, know what they're going to do. Yeah. Clear objective. It'd be, like you said, measurable, and I like that. And that SMART acronym is really a good way to apply it, especially to that objective part. Yeah. And I always use SMART for your budget too. And I say, look at your budget. Is it specific? Is it measurable? Is it achievable? Is it relevant? Is it time bound? So you kind of want to use the same thing with your budget too, because a lot of times budgets are a weak point for a lot of organizations. They know how to run programs. They know what's worked, but they think, when I get to the budget, it's so like overwhelming. Or vice versa. You have your accountants who think programs are just so wide and varied. And grant writers kind of have to look at both of those and make sure they really mold together well. So make sure everything's specific in your budget, that you actually need it, that it's relevant to your program, that you think you can actually get if the cost is a good cost, it's achievable, right? And that it's time bound. It also has to be expended within the period of time for the funding source. So exactly. That's a good point. I never thought of putting the SMART acronym to the budget, but of course, like you have deliverables, especially in the budget, and you got to make sure the money's here at a certain date. If you're ordering something, it might take 6 months to get to you, and then by that time the program might not be in session because the season changed, or absolutely. Good. I like that. Thanks. Since we're talking about budget, which is money, let's talk about a little bit about the philosophy of money. I think people get hung up on asking for money sometimes, or how much to ask for, or is it too much, or is it worth it? But there's a philosophy behind that. A philosophy behind it, I think, that you have, and maybe you can share that with us. Yeah, actually, I have that as a section in my book because I think it's so important. So I'm kind of smiling as you're asking me this, because I'm like that's so. I kind of knew that, so as a leading question. Yeah, you're leading it. Okay. But yeah, there is a philosophy of the money, and but please share that. Yeah. So I think that's important because it's funny. It's actually ironic, right? When it comes to grants, people are like, oh, there's just so many grants out there. There's so much money for anything, right? There's kind of like this mindset. But at the same time, when you mention budget to somebody, like, oh, I'm working on my budget, they're like, ooh, they cringe. Right. So it's kind of like this conflict. But basically, yeah, I mean, grants are money. It's money that's going to fund your project, right? And it's not free money at all by any means. It's money that you have to be responsible for. So that's another thing with mindset. But as far as the philosophy behind it, I really think in abundance and have an abundant mentality where, you really have to believe that what your projects are, they're worthy of value, and that you can't just be like, oh, you know what, we're going to make this small. We're going to pay people just this much. We're going to we're just going to go on a shoestring budget. And it's kind of this martyr mentality that's like, oh, we're awesome because we're on a shoestring budget and we're still pulling this stuff off. I kind of feel that sometimes with some nonprofits. And I'm like, yeah, that's not good. That's actually not a good mentality to have, because those nonprofits also have a high turnover rate. They have, they're burned out. Maybe their programs fall apart because shoestring budgets aren't good for sustainability. I understand that a lot of times you start off that way, and I totally get that. But you should also think of, from the get-go even, of, we're going to pay our people living wages, and that's okay. If you want people to stay, it still is a job. No matter if it's a nonprofit or a for-profit, they still need to be able to, a lot of people that come into jobs, they do have good education. They have a bachelor's or a master's, and they're working hard. So automatically they're part of a nonprofit. They should be paid peanuts. That really doesn't make any sense. Right. They're not going to be able to really devote themselves entirely to that nonprofit if that's the mentality of the nonprofit. So if you come in with abundance and really work on a nice budget that makes sense, then I really believe that that's a mentality that you should have.
And does that reflect well in the grant? Like, I'm evaluating the grant. I'm in the budget. I'm the evaluator. I'm looking at this. I'm like, well, here's a shoestring budget. Do they recognize that? And is this something like, or do they, oh, good, they're really trying to make ends? Like, how does that work?
No. It's funny because reviewers actually are obviously if you have, we're going to pay our executive director $150,000 a year. I mean, that's kind of excessive, like in most cases. It depends on the nonprofit, but really in smaller, medium ones, you're kind of like, you need to go and look at what other people are getting for those same kind of jobs and really evaluate what's a fair price. So if we have these qualifications, you can compare it. And sometimes you can even attach that in a grant. So like, for instance, I'm sure this is similar to Alaska, but on Guam, our prices, we might ask for a little bit more, or some of the prices for our travel rates if we have to go to annual conferences is obviously a lot more because of the flights. And, a lot of things that we have in here are imported, and the cost of living is a lot higher. So sometimes we do kind of specify that. And that's fine. And reviewers will actually be fine to that, if you just explain it to them. It's almost contradictory, because if you say, we're going to try to do the shoestring budget, we're only going to pay people $10,000, we're going to say, whatever, $20,000 or, whatever, then they're going to look at that and say, is that achievable? And they might say, you know what, that's not really achievable, because I don't know how they're going to sustain that person if they're only paying them that much. So, it's almost like that's, reviewers will look at that, and they'll look at what are the going rates, and what do you actually need to get this done? If you're not asking for enough, then can you really get it done?
Right. Yeah, and I think that would go the same with equipment then too. So if you're like, well, we need 10 laptops for this program, but we're going to get the refurbished or donated laptops to save us some money. So the grant, so it doesn't look like we're asking for so much. Whereas they may actually want you to go get the good stuff, because it makes the program more sustainable.
Right. Yeah. And that's true. It's totally true. I mean, you can use for your matching certain things, and I totally understand when you come to matching, but when you're just asking for direct program expenses from the grant, they are going to want to know that, you've had and sometimes you might even say, here's 3 quotes for something, right? Here's 3 quotes for that trailer or whatever. Right. This one might be a little bit more expensive, but I can have it delivered within 2 weeks, where the other one's going to take 6 months. So you can even say, ask for something more expensive, as long as you explain. And with grants, and like how you said before, you're communicating with this grant reviewer, and that's really been key to your success and really working with them. And that's really what they want. It's all about communication. Don't be afraid to call them up and say, is this, this is really what we're looking at? Is this something you consider? And just talk to them. With federal grants, that's a lot more difficult. I will say that, but it's doable.
Yeah, and if you have that communication, like when we needed a trailer for, we transport our dogs, and so we need a good heavy-duty safe trailer, because there's 20 dogs in this trailer that has this compartment on it. And that trailer, we asked for what we needed and what we wanted, and we had to adjust it a little bit and kind of tweak it, and like, okay, well, we can do this, and then we had to put the dogs, but it worked out. I mean, we got within what they wanted, and we still got a super good trailer, and everything worked out.
That's awesome.
But we had to redefine our budget and redefine our need in some sense. Not our need, our objective, because the need was still the same. We wanted to safely transport dogs, but the objective became less dogs, and which worked out good because we have other ways of transporting. Hey, Holly, we're just about out of time here. I want you to share again with us all the different things that you're doing and how we can get a hold of you to participate in those things.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, my whole kind of overall thing is just to help nonprofits and I even work with for-profits to increase their funding and their sustainability for the projects that they're really passionate about for their community. And through doing that, having that mission is I really work with a lot of people for grant writing, also technical writing, board and governance training, strategic development, and diversification of funding. And yeah, so that's about it. So I have a book, Wish Granted, Tips, Tools, and Templates to Write a Winning Grant. And that is a workbook. So it's fun to get through, and that comes with free, reusable, downloadable templates that you can use over and over again for your grant writing purposes. So yeah.
That's awesome. And I have on the screen here your website, which I started with in it. Great. So here is her website, folks. Again, it is at grantwritingandfunding.com, which is a great URL. And so good snag on that one. You have this great Get Started over here, the green button in the top right-hand corner. So that's going to get people where they need to go. And you have a podcast. So name of the podcast, people, obviously these are podcast listeners. So I'm sure they're interested.
Grant writing and funding. So
perfect. Yeah, like Nonprofit Ally.
You on my, exactly. And I hope to have you on my podcast. I would love to.
Yeah, we should do that.
Yes.
That'd be a lot of fun. And let me switch my window here. You can't, I'm not sharing my screen, but I just switched over to the Wish Granted. This is the Amazon page where you can get Wish Granted tips, tools, and templates to write a winning grant. And so, folks, these links will be in the show notes. Hey, Holly, thanks so much for being on the program. It was really a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you. It was so much fun. I really appreciate you.